So I was welcoming you, that's what I was doing, cordially, to Hatchards. Thank you very much, Hatchards, for hosting our event tonight for The Prince and the Plunder. So I'm Cynthia Hamilton. I'm the head of PR and marketing for the History Press that publishes The Prince and the Plunder, and the lovely Andrew Heavens. So it's lovely to be here tonight. I just wanted to say a few words to introduce both of our lovely authors tonight, because when we were organising for Andrew to be here, I actually was really hoping we'd get Barnaby Phillips, but I didn't think it was likely. And now you're both here, so that's fabulous. It's a dream for me. And since the book's been published in February, we've had some great reviews, a couple just this week, and we were very surprised when the Daily Mail actually really loved it.
First one.
Yeah. We were very surprised. We didn't know what to expect. We thought it was going to be a culture war. But they actually said it was fascinating and haunting. Okay? So remember that when you're about to buy a copy, or two. Excellent. And The Economist said it was vivid. All About History recently said it was deeply moving account of a life cut short and the fate of a kingdom's treasures. And that you had a very good writing style. I thought, yes, which I think is fantastic. And then today we had another review come in saying that it was engrossing, eye-opening, but traumatic.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, and so it's been a fabulous book to publicise, and I just can't wait for you all to read it. But I've got to hand over because Barnaby's going to be asking Andrew lots of exciting questions. So enjoy.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming on a rainy Friday evening. We're delighted to have a packed room here. I'm delighted to be asked by Andrew to present his fantastic book. I think he asked me because my own book came out last year, Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes, and perhaps he saw some similarities. There are similarities, in fact, in our biographies. We both have long connections with Africa as journalists. I think we both have Kenyan childhoods and Nigerian connections as well. But more recently, we have both respectively studied two notorious incidents in British imperial history. 1897, Benin myself, and 1868, Magdala. Which is the focus of Andrew's wonderful book. Two notorious moments of plunder, and the repercussions of that plunder are very much with us, and in some ways have come alive over the last 4 or 5 years in ways that I don't think many of us had anticipated, and perhaps that's why I know some of you have come this evening. But of course, in the case of Magdala, Andrew's book, there is an added tragedy, which is the extraordinary story of the, I'm not sure if we'll call it the abduction, I'm not sure what word you would use, Andrew, of a young prince from the defeated kingdom in Abyssinia, and his short and tragic life here in Britain. We'll talk about that, but Andrew, perhaps you should tell us first, why did you write The Prince and the Plunder?
Oh, thanks very much for that. I should say, we're so similar. We were at primary school at the same time in Nairobi, I think, so yeah. Wow. And now we're here today.
What primary school?
Oh, two different ones, yeah. St Christopher's and
Hospital Hill, a Nairobi City Council school.
I'm glad we got that out of the way. Anyway. So I mean, to start with how I wrote the book, I mean, it's called The Prince and the Plunder, and it started with plunder. Can you hear me with that one?
I think mine seems to work better.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
You did it.
So the story really started with the plunder. So it was about 2001, where, if I can remember right, the world seemed even darker and scarier than it does today, just after 9/11. And for various complicated reasons, I had left journalism when I was working for the church in Scotland. And one day a minister came in and said he'd been bored one day and had been digging around a cupboard in his church in St John's, west end of Princes Street, and had found a flat case in the back of it with the words on the leather, taken from Magdala, 1868. And inside that case is something that I can't describe to you because it's what's known as a tablet. If you're an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, it's possibly the most sacred object you can imagine. The vicar from the church, the Reverend John McGluckie, looked at it, had a chat with the congregation, and almost without thinking, they said, well, this isn't ours. We've no idea how it got here. We ought to give it back. And so he and I helped him contact the Ethiopian embassy and organise a return. And really the book was born a day when I went to Waverley Station in Edinburgh, and a train came in, and out walked a delegation of priests from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, from Aksum, a delegation from the embassy, a delegation from the Ethiopian World Federation, and came and basically, first of all, visited the church to make sure it was a tabot, because there was a little doubt that it might be. Saw it, the moment it came out from its hiding place, they burst into song, and that kicked off an 8-hour mass party Eucharist insane celebration, which was my first contact with Ethiopian culture. And I think the reason that after that it set me on a new path, the tablet was returned to Ethiopia, where tens of thousands of people came onto the streets to welcome it home. And for me, it was such a startling moment, because, as I say, the world was a dark and scary place then. And from this one act of return, of repatriation, and most importantly, an act of return made with little thought, instinctively, this isn't ours, we ought to return it, and a return that was received so graciously, it kind of shone out. I can remember that. So as a result of that, we moved to Ethiopia, worked as journalists, found out more and more about Emperor Tewodros, who, as I'm sure lots of you know, is a towering figure in African and Ethiopian history. And then, as I found out more, there was this little footnote at the bottom of most of the books. It said, oh yeah, by the way, as well as Emperor Tewodros, that he had a little son, Alamayu, who came to Britain and, as he said, lived a short and fascinating but tragic life. And that's it, over in 2 paragraphs. I just thought it was such a shame. So it's at that point that I decided to switch around, and this was really a book about put the prince at the beginning. And that's where eventually, slowly, I worked on the book, and here we are today.
And just set the scene for those who don't know. Why did the British invade Abyssinia in 1868? I mean, in your book, you argue very convincingly that actually it was all to do with India. Britain didn't really have any interest. It was a rather careless act.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, there was, this, as I said, this towering magnetic figure called Emperor Tewodros, who had through the force of his own character and through the force of his own military might, had forced the divided kingdom to unite, and in a way created the first early days of the modern state of Ethiopia. He'd started reaching out to what he saw as the other great Christian powers in the land. They, were his equals. He was a great Christian monarch in Africa. He wanted to reach out, monarch to monarch, to the other great powers. So in this case, he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. You can still see it in the National Archives. It's so passionate. You really have to read it word for word. But essentially saying, in the words of an earlier message, I'm a child of Christ, you're a child of Christ. For God's sake, I want friendship. So he was reaching out, had dreams of a great alliance. And unfortunately, this is where the story hits the great wall of British bureaucracy, because the letter made it all the way back up the Red Sea, through Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and hit a bureaucrat's desk in Whitehall and somehow disappeared, moved from desk to desk, shelf to shelf. This, because of a whole other range of misunderstandings, enraged the emperor, and he started imprisoning the few Europeans in his territory to increase pressure. And this is where it comes in, I think, that Britain, who had up to now been, had barely heard about Abyssinia, I think, we're talking about from the sense of the government, a little bit bemused about what was going on, suddenly realised that it was facing a massive diplomatic crisis, that from the eyes of the world, its representative, because Tewodros imprisoned the ambassador, the consul, had been imprisoned by, from what it saw as a sort of African chief or something like that. And this was just after Britain had had the narrow escape with the Indian Mutiny, also known as the First War of Independence. And it was desperate not to keep up its standing in the world, not to be seen to be belittled by another power, not to encourage, in the words of an MP, the Indian Muslims coming up the Red Sea to the Islamic sites, to hear this story of a upstart African monarch who had dared to imprison Britain. So as a result of that, Britain sent in this massive military expedition, taken from British India, from Britain, and from other parts of what was then the British Empire, and climbed up into the mountain empire of Ethiopia to free the captives. That was the same.
Really, and an absolutely overwhelming military victory. I think 2 British soldiers are killed, and however many hundreds of Abyssinians are.
Yes,
are
yeah.
slaughtered.
I mean, it was essentially coming in with the equivalent of space age military technology against an army that had up to then been undefeated and that had carved out united Ethiopia by force, but came in with what looked like rifles that never stopped shooting, rockets designed to take out ships, the rockets that are immortalised in the Star Spangled Banner, you know, the rockets went glare, cannons, just relentless, a wall of bullets. We hadn't quite got to the Maxim gun yet, but this was, which is, you know, your book's a few decades on where the Maxim gun was a decisive instrument. But our weapon of mass destruction was the Snyder rifle. And essentially one decisive battle on April the 10th, 1868, the British troops essentially wiped out the bulk of Tewodros' army in a matter of hours. And as you said, on the British side, a few wounded. On the Ethiopian side, 500, 700,000 killed. There was a sort of a pause. The emperor agreed to release the captives, hoping that would end it. But remember that Britain's motivation was to save its face, so it couldn't just leave. So it charged on and laid siege to the mountain fortress of Magdala, which is one of the world's stunning natural fortresses. We went there, and if you didn't have, you know, in the days before advanced weaponry, before planes, almost impossible to take. But because this was now the days of mass weaponry, the British troops surrounded him, stormed in, and in a famous gesture, which I understand has passed through the generations in Ethiopia as an act of defiance against the first major act of defiance against the growing might of the imperial powers that were going to come. Tewodros took his own life, repeatedly with a pistol that Queen Victoria had given him in earlier happier days. So the British troops stormed in and found his body lying on the top of the fortress, most of his followers gone, and set on rampage across the flat top mountain. Yeah.
And sketch his body as it lies there, and then rip the clothes off the corpse. Is that right?
If you see images of the time show Tewodros lying in a kind of as you might imagine, a king in a cathedral vault, you know, a very dignified pose, and the British officers grouped at a distance, keeping a respectful distance from their fallen foe, and it looks very noble. But that's exactly what didn't happen. Essentially, the British soldiers, possibly frustrated because they hadn't had what they saw as a decent fight, charged through the barricades, and in the world of one of the British officers watching, like a pack of human vultures, descended on the body of Ethiopia's great king of kings, Tewodros II, and started taking mementos, which were scraps of his clothes, which some of them dipped in the blood. You know, that's the ultimate battle trophy. You know, the blood of your vanquished enemy. And some took lockets of his hair. Well, lockets, that sounds much too posh. Basically took bits of his hair, cut it off, and ripped it off, and then started a rampage across the top of Magdala, which, as I said earlier, Tewodros had been this great unifying figure and had dreams of one unified power, one national treasury, one national library. So he had spent his years collecting this national treasury, national archive, national library, and collecting also a little bit of plundering himself, we've got to be said, of the other troops. So basically Britain struck at exactly the wrong moment in terms of Ethiopian heritage, because this wasn't just a few bits and pieces that soldiers picked off the battlefield. This was possibly for the first time in centuries the massed wealth of Ethiopia's ecclesiastical literature. Remember, this is an ancient Christian civilization that he was leading back to the 4th century. Piles and piles of illuminated manuscripts, gold crowns, everything you can think of was basically collected neatly and catalogued in his fortress, ready to be at the core of a new nation. Obviously, in this case, ready to be very effectively and very quickly stolen because it was all their way to. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk about the plunder in a moment, but let's just talk about the prince.
Yeah.
They take his 6-year-old son, who's at the heart of your story. Why do they take him?
Well, can I just step back about the prince? Essentially, this is a story about a boy who, a boy called Prince Alamayu, who spent the first 6 years of his life on a mountain, on top of a mountain in the highlands of Ethiopia. And when I was trying to picture it in my head, I had various images from fiction. I kept on coming back to, the little prince, Le Petit Prince, out on his little promontory in space, looking out at a fixed horizon, and everything he saw around him was his empire, his father's empire, King of Kings Tewodros II. He probably had the most glamorous father in history, who would come on zooming in from campaigns and zooming out again. He had a beautiful young mother in her 20s, Queen Terenesh. And so he'd spent the first 6 years of his life with a fixed horizon, because he pretty much always lived on top of this mountain. How many here have been to the highlands of Ethiopia? It's just, you have to be there to see it. It's impossible to describe it. It's stunning. But for him, this was his universe. And then suddenly, because of this bizarre, absurd breakdown in British-Ethiopian relations, these weird foreigners turned up with these superhuman weapons and essentially ripped his world apart. His father took his own life, took everything that was on the manifesto. And then, because the emperor's enemies were circling as well from the other regions of Ethiopia, the British troops felt that they arrived on this mountaintop and they found a little boy and a 20-year-old woman and a few other retainers on their own, left behind on the fortress. And so the commander, Sir Robert Napier, felt initially that the responsible thing to do was to take the boy and the mother under escort, at least away from the scene. So I wouldn't say that Alamayu was abducted or kidnapped.
Right. And
the initial thing was a humanitarian rescue gesture, but things changed thereafter.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you say that the British Act is in any way mitigated by the fact that the Emperor had expressed the desire for his son to be educated in England?
I mean, this was so as we always find in your book as well, that when the British came back from the event, there were fixed stories that they told. And the story that was told was that Alamayu's father had repeatedly said that he wanted Britain to look after his sons, and that Alamayu's mother, who, we can just jump ahead to that, awfully tragically, within less than a month of them leaving the fortress, she succumbed to something that was probably tuberculosis and died. So essentially leaving this little 6-year-old, just about to turn 7, his father's enemies. But yeah, the myth that the British told was that she, on her deathbed, had begged the British to look after her son. And that this it was a natural progression to then take Alamayu home because the Emperor and the Empress had requested it. I mean, I don't want to go into details because we haven't got a huge amount of time, but basically there were people at the scene at the time who raised doubts about both those stories. Tewodros did ask for the British. In the early days, in the early glorious days, when there were these two adventurers called William Bell and Walter Plowden, the first British ambassador, basically our first go at British-Ethiopian relations, when it was essentially a big bromance. These guys fell in love with Emperor Tewodros in a very real way, because he was an amazing, compelling, divisive, violent figure, but still compelling. He had said them on a number of occasions, look after my son, or if anything happens to me, take my son, or I would like you to take my sons to Britain so they can learn how to rule. But that to me is clearly a request in the context of we're dreaming of a glorious British-Ethiopian alliance where we will be equal Christian powers, and you will look after my sons, I will look after your sons, we will learn from each other. Your sons will go to Ethiopia and learn your ways so we can be better friends. In the context of full-out ultra-violence, war, an explosion of relations, that doesn't hold anymore. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
When Prince Alamayu is brought back to Britain, he, in one sense, this is a tragedy, but he is somebody of consequence here, isn't he? I mean, please go and look up Queen Victoria's journals. They're all online. Type in his name. It crops up again and again.
You mentioned 5 different spellings.
Well, yeah, if you navigate the spellings, fair enough. But if you work out the spelling, it's there.
Yeah.
She sort of fawns over him. He's sent to, I don't know if this counts as abuse or privilege. He's sent to Cheltenham and Rugby public schools. He's sent to Sandhurst. He's perceived as somebody who matters, even though at one level he's being horribly abused. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it must have been overwhelming for him because there was this bizarre. It wasn't this bizarre, not double think, maybe triple think, quadruple think that he was having to live with. So essentially, he was a prince, a member of a royal family, and in Britain, and that he was recognised as such within Britain. So he met Queen Victoria within 2 days of arriving. At the same time, he was the son of a man that the British press and the British government had started to had to justify the war and explain the war, had started to portray as a monster. And also, obviously, he was at every stage of his career. He was the only black boy on the boat, in the village, in the town, in the city, wherever he went. So that it must have been and remember, at the heart of this, although none of the commentators mention this, we've got a 7-year-old boy who had just lost his dad, and a few weeks later had lost his mum, had lost his country, had lost his fixed horizon, which is suddenly shaken. He'd been just to the sea, he'd been shoved on a steam train, a steamboat. It must have been terrifying and traumatic. Then he's treated as a prince, but also this was the age of if you wanted to be a racist, you could be a racist while following the science. You could there was the pseudoscience of phrenology, where you wouldn't just be racist. You would say, well, obviously there are various justifications why the races are superior, inferior, and it was all to do with gauging different features. So constantly, Alamayu found himself studied closely, constantly watched. This is a theme about the people who saw him, that he always felt he was under observation. And there's this one bizarre event where he's basically, after all this trauma, he's plonked down on the shores of Plymouth. He's given sort of VIP tour of all the bridges and stuff. The next day he's plonked on a steam train, which must have been terrifying in itself. And then he spent an hour in the waiting room at Exeter and David Station, where the local hack from the local paper comes to interview him. And I feel this, because I used to be, I'm still at heart a local hack from a local paper. And I can remember, and it's frustrating because instead of realising that he has the key player in the key story in Britain at the time, this guy is a uber phrenologist. So he spends the hour staring at this little boy's head and writing, I'd say 800 words on anatomizing his features. So he talks about, estimates the size of the boy's sinus, weighs the thickness of the boy's lips against what he sees as the refinement of his features. So all I'm saying is that Alamayu was lauded as a prince, and as you say, Victoria, all the posh stuff, Cheltenham College, rugby. At the same time, he was constantly under the microscope, almost literally dissected by everyone who met him through this bizarre pseudoscience that justified the racism that he also must have experienced every day. So, lauded as a prince, but there was quadruple think going on. Yeah.
And going forward, without wanting to give the whole story away, what I'm intrigued about, Andrew, is how do you give this little boy a voice? Because the writing is not there, the interviews are not there, the observations are others are there. How do you get into his mind in your book? How do you achieve that?
Right. Well, I mean, that was the key challenge, because we're talking about a 6-year-old boy, and when we were 6, we didn't leave detailed diaries or letters or the usual stuff that a historian would pounce on. So I think what I decided to do was, first of all, fess up on the opening pages, and it says something along the lines of, most people would apologise for the lack of direct sources for their key subject, but in a way here, the lack of them is the key point that we don't get to hear from Alamayu. There are a handful of letters, there are a handful of statements, and there are reported speech. But that's the point, because this was a little boy who constantly, people spoke for him, people thought for him, people made decisions for him. This was his tragedy. So in a way, saying that I'm not even going to try to get in his head, I'm going to describe my struggle to get in his head, because he never got a chance to say anything. Well, not quite. There are some letters which are, when you come across them, it's beautiful. He suddenly jumps to life. But I mean, the other ways to do it are to look for conflicting narratives. So as I said, the British told stories to justify themselves, and in their story, so Reuters news agency gets the scoop for Alamayu's arrival in Britain, and they say that he stood on the prow of the boat and said something along the lines of, "What a glorious land! I never thought I would see the like." So that's Alamayu's first verbatim quote from a reporter, which obviously, he doesn't even speak English yet, and also he is not Miranda saying, "Oh, brave new world," whatever. So that the picture we have is of a boy grateful for his rescuers, overwhelmed by the wonder of British technology and British luxury, and grateful for the affection which he meets from the people around him. And then you find, if you just keep on digging and digging, I found a letter written to the Picture Post in 1960 from a guy who was then in his 90s, who recalled bumping into Alamayu retinue in Plymouth. And he said this little boy was fuming with anger. He was saying, I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to wait until I can get admitted and I'm going to kill everybody. You know? So you can imagine a 6-year-old boy, 7-year-old boy, fuming with righteous indignation that his home had been taken. So that's an example of a crack in the narrative where you can see things. The other thing is to listen out for the many dogs who don't bite. So don't bark.
Bark.
Yeah, that's the thing. So when there are obvious gaps in the narrative and you can think, well, what fills those? So for example, Alamayu, traumatized, is brought down from his mountain home, whipped through the Ethiopian highlands at top speed, and then his mother drops dead. You know, his beautiful 20-something mother, his last link to his home. And we hear nothing about Alamayu at all from all, and there are many, the wonderful thing about this expedition is that all the soldiers wrote diaries, all the soldiers wrote letters. And you'll find if you look, there are loads and loads of books about the military expedition, and about apparently it was a very impressive engineering feat. But suddenly there's this gap for about a week where we hear nothing from Alamayu, no descriptions. And you just have to theorise that he must have been in such a state that he would have destroyed the British narrative. You know, how can you romanticise and celebrate a destroyed child? So, and sorry, the final thing, which leads on to the next part of the book, is that when you're trying to tell the story of someone who doesn't say anything, you can use objects. And this is why it's the Prince and the Plunder, because I used the many objects that the British soldiers brought back with them in the crates alongside Alamayu. And just one example, another even more difficult person to get your head round is Alamayu's mother, Queen Terenash, who's, from the accounts I see, just almost like a cipher. Her name was beautiful gold. She was almost like a symbol. And she got no chance to say anything. You know, she died very quickly in the story. And I remember my own, so this is a quick nip into the personal. When I lost my own parents, there was this bizarre, intimate moment where you leave the church and you go to their home, and you start going through the drawers, you know, and you find their possessions. And the things that meant the most to me were the broken bits of costume jewellery that you can remember your mum wearing, or the worn-out dress, or, you know, all these things. And so for me, when I see these things, which, you know, as a family we split between us, and remember my mother, if you go to the V&A now, you can have exactly the same experience with Queen Terenash, because the British packed up her dresses, her belongings, her jewellery, including one bit of broken costume jewellery, about 72 items of jewellery, 2 stunning dresses, shawls, and it's all there. Sometimes they put it on a mannequin and put it on display, and it's unreal. Suddenly this woman, who in my head is a symbol of beauty and motherhood, suddenly is a real mother, because you can see the dirt on the dress, you can see the fact that when she was married she was 12, and so she grew up into her queenhood, so they kept on sewing panels onto the bottom of the dress. And there are similar things. If you look in the museums, you can find bits of Alamayu in the same way that you can find bits of his father, bits of his mum, bits of his kingdom scattered all over our country. And in a way, that's a way to bring these people into 3D.
I think that brings us nicely on to the Plunder, the second part of the book. I think one of the things about, for example, the Benin bronzes is they weren't really part of the British agenda when they went to topple the king, but when they brought them back, they caused a sensation. But I'm wondering if Magdala was a little bit different, because, after all, the British Museums send a collector with the expedition. So clearly there is the expectation that there will be something worth collecting and bringing back. This
is the thing that sets this campaign apart, although it doesn't have the profile of the Benin bronzes. Essentially, you have to step back and think, what did Ethiopia Abyssinia mean to the British at the time? And this was before the scramble for Africa, so we hadn't chopped up the continent into bits and pieces. Essentially, Britain was nibbling at the edges, and the Imperial powers were nibbling at the edges, and they had a map with loads of spaces in the middle. And in the middle, they filled with blank spaces and with dreams and fantasies. And so Ethiopia was a place of Prester John. Have you come across Prester John, this mythical priest, king, warrior, who was loaded with, this for some reason we were fixated on this for centuries, that we would find a great Christian ally out there somewhere. He was in China, Ethiopia, all over the place. No one ever found him. So Abyssinia was one of the places where Precious John was supposed to be. The Ethiopian emperors traced their line back to King Solomon. Obviously King Solomon, King Solomon's mines, endless riches. The foundation myth of part of Ethiopia is the fact that the Ark of the Covenant was brought from Jerusalem, and the real Ark of the Covenant is still there in a church in Axum. So that was another myth, that maybe we could find the Ark of the Covenant and all the mystical treasures that contained. Basically, the British heads were filled with dreams that maybe we'd also find a lost stash of classical manuscripts, etc., etc., etc. So, for the first time and the last time in the British Museum's history, they heard the rumblings in Parliament that this military expedition was going to go into uncharted territory, and so they got in touch and said, "Would you mind if we sent someone along?" So, the first time in a real way, the British Museum went to war, because with a huge budget to essentially do any excavations, time team high-speed expeditions it could do along the way, take anything it could buy along the way, and then when it got there, get its hands on as much of the plunder as it could. And the guy was a guy called Richard Rivington Holmes, and he went in there with his massive budget. And when the British had this chaotic day of plunder, and the officer said, "This won't do at all. We'll now introduce a much more civilized form of plunder, which is basically give us everything you've grabbed. We'll now auction it back to you." So they piled up all the plunder on a plane outside Magdala, and all the officers got a chance to bid for their piece of the treasure. The idea was then to raise prize money for the troops, in the way that British forces go, especially through the Navy, had done for years, the splitting of prize money. So, yes, it's bizarre actually, because we went in there with great expectations, we got what we wanted, brought it back, dumped it at the British Museum. The initial reaction was largely disdain, if you read the contemporary accounts of the initial exhibition. And then almost all of it was put in a box, put into storage, and that's where it remains. So I always say that if every single piece of Magdala plunder went back, and we're talking about 1,500 pieces, we wouldn't notice the difference, because hardly any of it's out there. But I mean, the reverse with yours is we went out there without any great expectations of what we find, apart from a few myths of maybe gold dust and some ivory, and found one of the wonders of the world, and brought back, and the Benin bronzes are now world famous because they were prized, they were put on display and lauded. Yeah.
I think we're going to go to questions in just a few minutes,
Yeah.
but as you intimate, we are in the era of restitution, and at the back of your book there's a fantastic directory. You've done amazing work at digging up where Magdala treasure is. The list is there.
Yeah.
I know some small bits of it have gone back. If it goes back to Ethiopia, who does it belong to? The church? Where does it go to? Who looks after it?
Well, I think up to now it's been fairly mixed, as in it's dependent on the nature of the campaign. So over time, the thing that got me involved first of all was the Tabot from Edinburgh, and that was sent back through the official channel of the Ethiopian embassy and the government. But because a Tabot is such a sacred thing, it has no purpose apart from what it's made for, which is to give life and the presence of God to a church. So it went to the church, obviously. And as I say, when it came back, tens of thousands of people came out to the streets and welcomed it, and it still sits in the heart of a church in Ethiopia. There have been intermittent campaigns by academics and campaigners and the Rastafarian community in Shashamane, and that has depended on individual links. So a lot of stuff has gone back to the Institute of Ethiopian Studies in Addis Ababa University. As I understand it, there's now a much more organised plan in mind, where there are government committees and bodies that are dedicated to drawing up a list of the missing treasure and being the official funnel through that. I'm not 100%, and there still would be, obviously, when it comes to things like tabots, they can only belong to a church. But as I understand it, it's now a much more centralised, and as I understand it from the science and the law of restitution, as restitution has become more and more like a mainstream thing, it tends to only happen government to government. Which obviously it has complications in itself, especially in your case, because who owns the Benin bronzes? Does Nigeria own it, or the Kingdom of Benin, etc., etc., etc. But at least the government is taking the lead, even in the Benin case, isn't it? In negotiating.
They very much asserted control
Yes.
of a process they maybe did not control at the beginning.
Yeah.
I think we should move to questions, shouldn't we? Cynthia? How long have we got for the Q&A?
I think about 15 to 20 minutes. They
Okay.
look keen.
They look keen. Okay.
Just need to get Sienna. So Sienna's going to come down with the mic if we've got questions at the back. So
All right.
so people
So
can hear.
please raise your hands. There's a lady at the front here. Yep.
I think I thought Tarnish hated Theodore because he put her father in prison. That's what I got from the archives I had, and also a penny in the income tax was put on the British subjects. So they must have known, a penny must have been quite a lot of money in those days. And the other thing
To
was-
fund
To
the
fund
campaign.
the
fund
invasion.
the campaign.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing was he was much loved from when he left Ethiopia by Captain Speedy, and then he married Cornelia Cotton, and they loved him, and there's lots of stories in the book I wrote 100 years ago on how they really, and my mother lived with, they lived with my mother's family, and they always
I should say you are Captain Speedy's
great,
great
well, yes.
niece.
And-
We didn't actually mention Captain Speedy. So
No, at all, not at all. Because I mean, you put forth this, child who's completely exploited and everything else. And I mean, he was loved and cared for. And the British Army, they couldn't do anything else because there he was one doesn't know because it's all
Yeah.
bits.
But I think that was just in this address, sort of skirted over the details. It's
Yes,
true
bit,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That. So really on the stage, we've got Jean
Well,
Sutherland.
I didn't know him or anything, but I've always been brought up with this thing how they adored Alamayu and how he
Yeah.
was taken away from them.
No doubt about it.
And
Which is
for
why
Queen Victoria, he was a sort of sub-guardian,
Which is why I said it was double speak, triple speak, quadruple speak, because it wasn't simple victimization. He wasn't abducted. He wasn't straight out abused. He just faced a very confusing mixture of
Well, at
things.
7,
And
he
one of
probably wouldn't know what he was facing, actually.
no, and one of the elements he found was real affection from the family that
But
took
the
him.
whole Isle of Wight, all those
Yeah.
people, everyone knew him. And it was a rather smart place, the Isle of Wight, with Queen Victoria and
Yeah.
everything. And he was all part of that for a while.
But we were still talking about a matter of weeks or months after losing his parents. So he
Yes, but
and
he
there
did
are
get
descriptions of
taken
him
back
having
by
night
Speedy.
terrors and.
But we do want to open
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
up
yeah.
for questions.
Well,
It should just be a
Thank you.
one-to-one.
But that's
Yeah.
certainly a
Let's
good
open it up.
point. I think.
Any other
Thank you.
questions?
Yeah.
Andrew, it's a great book.
Thank you.
We're only halfway through it at the moment, but it's
Tell us who you are.
I'm Lewis McLaughlin. I'm editor of Returning Heritage.com. And like yours, Barnaby, it's a real page turner. So congratulations.
Well, thanks very much.
Yes.
What I wanted to know, though, was with the accession of Charles III, can I whip to the end of the book? We know that his remains, the human remains of Alamayu, are in Windsor Castle,
Yep.
St George's Chapel. Knowing that, perhaps unlike the previous late Queen, King Charles is far more open to world religions, particularly Orthodox. I wonder whether, being more peculiar, he might be more disposed to an approach to return his human remains.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a wonderful thought because you're right that up to now, Alamayu is buried in a catacomb outside St George's Chapel, and Ethiopia has 2 times, as far as I know, but I'm sure many other times, formally requested Britain to return his remains to Ethiopia, so he can be buried with his father in Western Ethiopia. And up to now, because Windsor Chapel is royal peculiar, so the royal family get to decide what happens to it. It's not like the other churches in Britain. And up to now, they've said that because he's buried in a catacomb outside the chapel, which shared space with other bodies, that you wouldn't be able to move him without disturbing lots of other places, without disturbing lots of other people. I mean, who knows? I mean, whether King Charles will have a different attitude, because you're right, it's a judgment call, isn't it? What do you call disturbing remains? No one's suggesting going in there with a bulldozer, and there must be very clear ideas of precisely where he is in the plot.
I thought you said in the book that he was in a coffin which had a clear label.
Oh, there's no doubt. The description of the funeral has a plaque on the coffin, and if anyone wants to look inside, they'll also find letters from Victoria, gifts from Victoria that she asked to have buried with him. So, but you wouldn't have to sew the body to that extent. The coffin says on the top of it, Prince Alamayu, so there'd be no doubt. But I mean, who knows? I mean, we'll wait and see. And I'm sure Ethiopia will try another request. Yeah.
my own observation on that was having had some dealings with the Royal Collection in connection with 3 fabulous Benin bronzes they have, which you would have thought would be sort of an incredible goodwill gesture and sort of perhaps, really transform the monarchy's image in Africa almost overnight, is that they are a fairly conservative institution and not leading the way in this regard, is my own experience. But is there anyone at the back who would like to...
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Of course, if Prince Harry wants to say anything about it.
That's it.
Thank you, first of all. I'm really looking forward to reading both of your books. I was very struck by the imagery of the Scottish Church handing back the tablets. The stark contrast between what they did, which was obviously the right thing to do, and what the British Museum hasn't done. And the Ethiopian Church has been asking for such a long time now for the tablets to be handed back. They're so sacred, as you said, they can't ever be viewed. They don't really form part of the collection at all, and the circumstances in which they were taken could not be clearer. There is no room for doubt. Did you speak to the British Museum when you were doing your work, and what's their position on handing the tablets back?
No, I didn't manage to get a quote beyond the standard position, which is... so just to recap, so there was this one Edinburgh tablet. There are 10, maybe 11 tablets in the British Museum. 10 of them definitely came from Magdala, the other one probably did. And there's one other tablet which is encased in an altar in Westminster Abbey. This is the really weird case. It's, an altar is basically a big flat wall at the back of a church. If you get your head round the back of it, you can see that where a window used to be, where the tablet was encased in the thing. And the key thing with this is that tablets are so sacred that you're not supposed to look at them, touch them, or handle them. So the British Museum and Westminster Abbey agreed, fine, okay, we will never look at it, touch it, display it, or handle it, or do anything with it. We also will not return it, because we're governed by the British Museum Act, and the Westminster Abbey don't want to damage their altar. So you've got this weird situation where essentially these sacred objects, and I can't stress how sacred they are. If you're an Anglican, you just don't get it. These are sacred to the power of 10. Are trapped in the weirdest of limbos. That they're in a little cave in the back of a cabinet, and in somewhere, maybe in a room or a shelf. Does anyone know? In the British Museum, when they will never be seen, touched, or handled. But that they live. And you're right that if they were to go back, I saw the celebrations for one tablet. If 12 tablets went back, I think Addis Ababa would. I don't know what would happen.
Come to a standstill.
Come to a standstill. Yeah. So what was was that the question?
The question actually is whether you've had an engagement with the British Museum, because I think it's so striking that, as you say, it's a win-win situation. It's obviously the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Not only would the Ethiopian Orthodox Church have its tablets back rightfully, but it would also show the British Museum in, I'd say, an entirely positive light. There can be no good reason for retaining them. And so my question was really, have you spoken to someone from the museum?
There's a standard line, basically. And so just because it's not a campaign book, it's up to Ethiopia to ask for its treasures to come back. I've used the objects to tell the story, and also in a sort of a vivid way of showing that even though we've all forgotten this story, if we look around us, it's everywhere. I found 580 objects in London and 800 across Britain, and if you count the animal skeletons, we're talking 2,500 or something like that. I don't think Ethiopia wants the animal skeletons back. Do you? No. But you're right. It would be. But as I understand it, and I think you would know best of all, the British Museum is guided by the British Museum Act, which forbids it from returning stuff. But people are arguing that there's a big gaping loophole in that.
It doesn't apply to the tablets.
No, because there's a thing saying. It's a legitimate clause which says if something's not fit for display, unfit to be retained.
Which is really critical. Unfit to be retained.
Yeah.
As Barnaby says, should an object which is never going to be exhibited, never photographed, never studied, and the BM have confirmed that, even the trustees themselves, who are the only people who can decide their future, are not allowed to view them.
Right.
That, to my definition,
Is unfit
is
to
unfit to
display.
be retained by an educational establishment.
Yeah.
What about the museum situation like that? I mean, have they got proper conservation,
It's a beautiful museum. I
because
mean,
they
again,
did-
I
yes.
don't want to stress the point that this is not a campaigning book. I'm not leading the campaign for the return of the Ethiopian treasures. That's up to Ethiopia. But the museums I've seen, what I'm proudest of is that my book is on its way to Addis at the moment, and it's going to go into the brand new, I've forgotten its name. What's the library in that? The brand new library in Addis Ababa. Abrahot. Yeah, and it's, I mean, to my eyes, it looks like as good as any library I've ever seen. The Institute of Ethiopian Studies is a beautiful. It's my favourite place in Addis. The National Museum of Ethiopia is good enough to hold the remains of Lucy, and it's a wonderful place in itself. Lucy, who's now, that's the base for world tours. Lucy, one of the early examples of us. So yeah, I would say there are amazing institutions in Ethiopia.
Yes, because they were really going to work at it, when I was there.
Right.
Okay, we got 5 more minutes for question. I know we'll get to it at the
Very
front.
good.
Yeah.
Very quickly, can I just come in at 2 points? For the Ethiopians,
Take a microphone.
oh, sorry. For Ethiopians, the prince is a VIP prisoner of war. That is established. When it comes to his repatriation, when Ethiopia celebrated the millennium in 2007, the then president of Ethiopia sent a very good letter of request to Her Majesty the Queen. I was fortunate enough to have seen it, beautifully written. 3 paragraphs talked about how great Ethiopia was, her visit to Gondar, and this and that. And at the last paragraph, she said, he is with 40 others, and it will be unfair to disturb. So there it remains, and my former colleague knows that better than I do. It's still the present case. There is also another case with the Victoria and Albert Museum when they celebrated 150th anniversary of the Battle of Magdala. This thing, and a new thing came up, and it was long-term loan. How long is long-term? All right? And the difficulty is when it comes to translating it into our own language, Amharic. When an Ethiopian hears that they are here on a loan, they're going to go crazy. What are you talking about? They came to our country, took away, and then you are making fool of ourselves. So it is still going on, and I hope we'll see a breakthrough. One last thing about the Ark of Covenant. It is a replica of the Ark of Covenant. Why is it that important? In Parliament, you have the royal mace. What does it signify? It signifies the concept of the king in Parliament. God, no Ethiopian church, no building is a building if it doesn't house an Ark of Covenant. That's why it is. One church could have as many as 12 Arks of Covenant for each cent or and so on. That's why it's been. My colleague and I have been discussion with the British Museum, and in 1995 the Patriarch of Ethiopia himself invited the director to come to Ethiopia, and there was an agreement, but condition was attached. That condition was that when it arrives in Addis, there will not be people out singing and dancing in celebration. That nobody can stop me. That is, and there it says. Thank you very much,
Okay,
and thank you for the explanation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For that context. We've got 5 more minutes, 4 more minutes. Yes, the lady at the front.
Sienna, sorry. Sienna's been very athletic.
Oh, sorry.
If I may, I'm actually following on from a recent incident in a church where security forces threw weapons and smoke into the public while worshipping. I'm afraid I don't believe that the church is in a fit state to stand up to the government.
In
to
Ethiopia.
ensure, yes,
Ah.
that's one. The second thing is that there is a 40-year anti-monarchist position as regards to Ethiopia, its constitution and its politics. So the concept of a returning prince's bones, whereas there is some people who would really enjoy that, and within the ethnic, federalist, highly tribalized politics of the moment, there's no doubt that in Gondar a certain amount of people would surely appreciate it. But I think the romanticization of Alamayu is partly really misplaced, and the appreciation and celebration that is envisaged is not the case. And I would propose, alternatively, as the British do with their graveyards of their soldiers in foreign countries, that they allow the Ethiopian embassy in London, if it agrees to be responsible for a prince, God forbid, because they're all socialist, communist, and whatever, but would they take responsibility, and would some sort of bone DNA test be done so that that body is kept in Windsor, where the young prince was treated well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, maybe, Andrew, perhaps you should have the very last word, and
Yes.
then be happy for book signing and all the rest of it. But, so my last question to you, you tell me very briefly, if I went to Magdala today, what would I see?
I mean, again, the problem is describing it, because it really is mind-blowing. So I went with a small party in 2004, I think. And first of all, it's not somewhere you can get to easily. You have to trek. You have to drive for a couple of days out of Addis. Then you have to park up and trek. Things may have changed since I was there, but it's a significant effort to get there. And once you've got your head around the beauty and the drama of the Ethiopian highlands, which are mind-blowing, you then have to get your head around this mountain on top of the mountain, which is, so essentially out of these twisted ravines, these black walls of black basalt rise up thousands of feet. It's sort of a trinity of hills that lead up to Magdala. And if you go, so in the day it was walled off with thorn fences and hedges, and this was essentially the capital of Tewodros' military effort, and where he kept everything that he prized. These days, there's a village there and a church, which, as I understand it, is campaigning actively for its own museum. Also, if you look around, you'll see Tewodros was famous for his artillery. So if you look around the summit of Magdala, you can still see the remnants of his guns. But basically, you'll get an idea of what it must have been like for Alamayu, or the little prince standing on a mountain, on the top of a mountain, on a promontory, staring out into this biblical scene. And I recommend it highly. I mean, there are more and more companies encouraging people to trek around the villages in this area. But it's something I won't forget visiting Ethiopia. And I'm struggling because I can't really describe it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have one final brief word.
I'm Wesley Bear, chaplain. Thank you so much for your contribution to the community you contribute. It's very vital that you can produce such a book, especially for the younger generation. I'm coming from this group of Rasta within the UK in London. But I would like to mention, before I'm going further, I'd like to give thanks to great granddaughter of niece, General Napier, for intervention. I would like to also congratulate and give thanks to Prince of Ethiopia, who is in our presence this day. This Magdala, as far as we know, is start with our brother who departed a few years ago, Rassimo MacLean, Gideon Festidus. According to his narrative, was instructed by the Rasta elders to go and find out about the famine in 1894 in Ethiopia. Once remember. Bob Geldof, thank you so much for the picture.
Seymour MacLean, the book liberator.
Yeah, the book liberator, thank you. So you went to find out, working within the city as a debutant accountant. He was starting. So you went to the British Library looking for family history in Ethiopia or whatever, and start to find documents pertaining to Magdala and so forth and so forth. According to Metropolitan Police, he did some magic and could retrieve over 1,000 books, booklets from the British Library. Went to jail, obviously, but he continued his campaigns, what was like Magdala campaign, name it. And at that time, he started to travel as a community to travel to Ethiopia and get in touch with the new government as the Derg was kind of collapsing. Derg and Ethiopia was getting to a new phase. His request, being in touch with the church, the Orthodox Church, also the government, and also I would like to mention one of the famous gentlemen of this country, Richard Pankhurst, great son of Sylvia Pankhurst, beloved. Being in touch with those people, Seymour MacLean developed that knowledge within our community, which myself I was very close to him for many years. He passed away in 2014. And he's the one really, even concerning the Tabot in Scotland, who intervened. At that time, you remember at that time we were together. And for many items that was returned, we really appreciate the works of Seymour MacLean, from private collection to his heir. The Emperor Locke's heir was returned a few years ago. His amulet also was returned a few years ago, etc. So I want to keep going. But one point I would like to mention is like this, according to the British records, it seems that it was one of the greatest campaigns of the British Empire, whereby they had the French, German, Spanish, and Italian professionals who went also to Magdala. It was not just the Parliament, British Parliament, had also to buy news. They had to buy news from Spain. We're talking about 200 elephants and over 1,000 mules traveling from the Red Sea to Magdala with the British Army. So it was very, very important campaign, and the return, according to British records again, and Seymour MacLean put the empire on the top of the map, if I would say so. The return for after a few years, you can see most of the great buildings of our city, 1890s, 1880. After Magdala, this is where we see that our empire, the British Empire, developed at a space. The second point was Alamayu.
Sorry, we don't really have time.
Yeah, I just finished Alamayu.
So the store closes at 8 o'clock.
This is very good.
If we want to sign and buy books, we have
Alamayu also
to start now.
Yes.
had the correspondence with his mom, his grandmom. His grandmom wrote to the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, asking for his return. Alamayu suffered sadness, the trauma, but the most pain I fought, according to our research and research in Ethiopia, the sadness and loneliness.
So I'm gonna
Thank
have
you
to
so
cut
much.
off. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a
Thanks, Russell.
point beautifully made and beautifully brought out in Andrew's book. I think he's spoken very well this evening. Hatchards does close in 25 minutes, which means you've got plenty of time to talk to us and buy books. But thank you, Andrew.
Very briefly, so we've got piles of books here. We've also got some behind the table, so there should be plenty for everyone. Just please slowly start to make the way forward to get them signed. Thank you so much for coming.
Can you get the book and get a sign for you?